The rich rancher's daughter didn't walk, but this construction worker changed her life. Michael Johnson never imagined that accepting that renovation job would change not only his life, but also the destiny of an entire family. The 42-year-old construction worker had been hired to repair the roof of the main house at Clearwater Ranch, one of the most prosperous properties in the Austin area. It was on his first day of work that he saw her. A girl of about 10 years old, blonde hair tied in a ponytail, wearing a pink blouse, was sitting in her wheelchair on the porch. Her blue eyes followed every movement of the workers with a silent curiosity that touched Michael's heart. "Hey you, construction worker!" shouted a rough voice behind him. Michael turned and saw Richard Anderson, the ranch owner, walking toward him with a stern face. He was an imposing man in his early 50s, with graying hair and an authoritative bearing that showed he was used to being obeyed without question. "I need you to finish this job in 2 weeks, and I don't want anyone bothering my daughter, understand?" "Yes, sir, you can count on me," replied Michael, taking off his beige cap as a sign of respect. Richard shot a warning look in the girl's direction before walking away. Michael noticed how she lowered her head when her father looked at her, as if she had done something wrong just by being there. During the first few days, Michael tried not to pay attention to the little girl, but it was impossible to ignore her constant presence on the porch. She was always there, watching silently, sometimes with a book on her lap that she rarely opened. There was something in her eyes that bothered him, a deep sadness that shouldn't exist on a child's face. "What's her name?" he asked Mrs. Jenkins, the house cook, during the lunch break. "That's Lizzie," replied the 60-year-old woman, lowering her voice instinctively. "Poor little girl, she hasn't walked for 5 years, ever since—" Mrs. Jenkins stopped talking abruptly, as if she had said something she shouldn't have. "Ever since what?" insisted Michael. "Since an accident," she murmured, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "But nobody talks about it here. The boss forbids it." Michael felt a tightness in his chest. 5 years was a long time for a child to carry such a heavy burden. He himself had a daughter the same age at home, little Emily, who ran and played in the yard every day. He couldn't imagine seeing her confined to a wheelchair. The next day, while climbing the ladder to check the roof tiles, Michael noticed that Elizabeth was looking directly at him. When their eyes met, she quickly looked away, but something made him give a discreet wave. To his surprise, she responded with a small, timid wave before looking around nervously, as if afraid of being seen. This small gesture became a daily ritual. Every morning when Michael arrived at work, he would wave to Elizabeth, and she would wave back, always with that timid smile that briefly lit up her face before giving way again to the melancholy expression. In the second week of work, Michael noticed that Elizabeth spent long hours watching the birds flying around the house. Her eyes followed every blue jay and robin that landed on the nearby trees, and he could see how much she wanted to get closer to them. During lunch hour, when all the other workers were resting, Michael had an idea. Using some leftover pieces of wood from the renovation, he began to build a small bird feeder. He worked quietly, hidden behind one of the porch columns, shaping each piece carefully. "What are you doing?" asked a soft voice behind him. Michael turned and saw Mrs. Wilson, Elizabeth's housekeeper, an elegant 65-year-old lady who had cared for the girl since birth. "I'm making a feeder for the birds," he replied, showing the nearly finished work. "I noticed the girl enjoys watching them." Mrs. Wilson looked at the feeder, and then at Elizabeth, who was sleeping in her chair on the porch. "That's very kind of you, but Mr. Anderson won't like it. He doesn't allow the staff to—" "I understand," Michael interrupted gently. "But sometimes children need small joys, don't they?" Mrs. Wilson sighed and shook her head. "You don't know the boss like I do. He can be very protective of Lizzie." Despite the warning, Michael finished the feeder that afternoon and installed it near Elizabeth's bedroom window, where she could see it clearly. He filled it with bird seed he bought with his own money and waited. The next day, he arrived early to work, just to see the girl's reaction. Elizabeth was in her chair on the porch, but this time her eyes sparkled differently. 3 blue jays and 2 robins were feeding at the small feeder, and she watched them with fascination. When she saw Michael, her face lit up with the first genuine smile he had witnessed. She pointed to the birds and made a gesture of thanks with her hands. Michael felt his heart warm. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Unfortunately, the joy was short-lived. At lunchtime, Richard appeared on the porch, his face red with anger, holding the feeder in his hands. "Who was the fool who did this?" he shouted to all the workers who were resting. Silence fell over the place. Michael swallowed hard and stepped forward. "It was me, Mr. Anderson." Richard approached him with firm steps, the feeder still in his hands. "Didn't I say clearly that I didn't want anyone disturbing my daughter?" "You did, sir, but I only thought that—" "You weren't paid to think," Richard exploded, throwing the feeder to the ground with force, shattering it to pieces. "You were paid to fix roof tiles." Out of the corner of his eye, Michael saw Elizabeth on the porch. The girl had witnessed the entire scene and was now crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the shattered pieces of the gift. "Daddy, no!" she cried out for the first time since Michael had been there. "He only wanted to be kind to me." Elizabeth's voice echoed across the yard, filled with a pain that made everyone present lower their heads. It was the first time in a long while that someone had done something special for her, and seeing it destroyed before her eyes broke her heart. Richard stopped for a moment, visibly shaken by his daughter's crying, but his expression soon hardened again. "Elizabeth, go to your room. Go to—" "And you," he pointed to Michael, "if you approach my daughter again, you'll be fired on the spot." Michael nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on Elizabeth as Mrs. Wilson led her into the house. The girl looked back one last time, her eyes still full of tears but also with gratitude. That night Michael couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Elizabeth's expression, the way she had defended his small gesture of kindness. There was something about that family that wasn't right, a coldness that went beyond a father's simple protection. The next day he arrived determined to finish his work and leave. It wasn't worth getting tangled up in a situation that wasn't his business. But when he climbed onto the roof, he saw Elizabeth again on the porch, and this time she didn't wave. She just looked at him with an expression of such deep sadness that it made his heart ache. In the afternoon, a strong storm formed on the horizon. The wind began to shake the trees violently, and the first raindrops indicated that the downpour would be intense. Michael came down from the roof and started gathering his tools when he heard shouts coming from the main house. "Water is coming into Elizabeth's room," cried Mrs. Wilson, running toward the men. "The roof is leaking." Michael grabbed his tools and ran to the house. Elizabeth's room was on the second floor, and when he got there, he saw that there was indeed a considerable leak right above the girl's bed. Water dripped from the ceiling and had already formed a puddle on the floor. "I need to go up on the roof to make an emergency repair," he told Mrs. Wilson, "but it will be dangerous with this rain." "Do whatever is necessary," she replied, worried. "The girl can't sleep in another room. She has terrible nightmares when she leaves here." Michael went up on the roof in the middle of the storm and worked quickly to stop the leak. The torrential rain made every move dangerous, but he persisted until he managed to make a temporary repair that would hold until the next day. When he came down, soaked, and with his hands cut by the broken tiles, he found Elizabeth in her room, sitting in a chair and trembling, not from cold but from fear. The thunder echoed loudly outside, and the girl was clearly terrified. Mrs. Wilson tried to calm her down, but without success. Elizabeth cried softly, her hands covering her ears with every thunderclap that echoed. "She always gets like this during storms," Mrs. Wilson explained to Michael. "Since the accident." Michael looked at the suffering girl and, without thinking twice, approached her. "Hi, Elizabeth, are you okay?" She looked at him with eyes red from crying and shook her head no. "Storms scare me," she murmured in a trembling voice. "Do you know what I used to do when I was a child and was afraid of thunderstorms?" asked Michael, kneeling beside her chair. Elizabeth shook her head, curious despite her fear. "I imagined that the thunder was just the noise of angels moving furniture up in heaven, and the lightning was them turning on the lights to organize everything just right." A small smile appeared on Elizabeth's face. "Really? Really? And you know what else? When the storm passed, they always left gifts for the brave children who weren't afraid." "What kind of gifts?" Prettier flowers in the garden, birds singing louder, and sometimes even rainbows. As Michael told his stories, Elizabeth gradually calmed down. She stopped crying and began to laugh when he used different voices for the characters in his childhood stories from the countryside. Mrs. Wilson watched everything with admiration. For months she had tried to calm the girl during storms, and this simple man had achieved in a few minutes what she couldn't in hours. "You have a gift with children," she whispered to Michael. "I have a daughter her age," he replied softly. "Emily. She also used to be afraid of thunderstorms." When the storm finally passed, Elizabeth was smiling and talking animatedly with Michael about the stories he had told. It was at that moment that Richard appeared in the doorway of the room, still wet from the rain, worried about his daughter. "Elizabeth, are you okay? I heard the roof." He stopped abruptly upon seeing Michael there, talking to his daughter as if they were old friends. "What are you doing here?" he asked in a controlled voice, but Michael could feel the anger behind the words. "Mr. Johnson fixed the roof and helped me with the storm, Daddy," Elizabeth said quickly. "He told stories about the angels who move furniture in heaven." Richard looked at his daughter, then at Michael, and finally at Mrs. Wilson, who just nodded in confirmation. "I appreciate you fixing the roof," he said coldly. "You may leave now." Michael Johnson stood up, but before leaving, he turned to Elizabeth. "Remember what we talked about angels, okay?" She nodded energetically, and for the first time since she had arrived there, Michael saw her truly happy. In the following days, Mrs. Wilson began to seek out Michael during breaks. She had observed the transformation in Elizabeth after that night's conversation and wanted to better understand that man who had achieved something that doctors and specialists could not. "May I ask a personal question?" she said one afternoon while Michael was resting under a tree. "Of course, Mrs. Wilson. Did you lose someone?" "There's something in the way you look at Elizabeth." Michael sighed deeply. "My wife passed away 3 years ago. Cancer. Since then, it's just been me and Emily. Maybe that's why I understand the pain in the girl's eyes." Mrs. Wilson nodded understandingly. "Elizabeth has also suffered losses. The accident that left her in a wheelchair. It was very traumatic for the whole family." "What exactly happened, Mrs.?" Wilson looked around to make sure they were alone. The family was coming back from a party. Mrs. Catherine was driving, Mr. Richard in the passenger seat, and Elizabeth in the back. A pickup truck hit them head-on on a dangerous curve. Michael felt a chill. And Elizabeth's mother. "Mrs. Catherine blames herself for what happened. She barely leaves her room since then. Mr. Richard has also completely changed. Before he was more human. Now, many things were starting to make sense. Richard's coldness, Elizabeth's sadness, the heavy atmosphere that hung over that house. It was a family destroyed by guilt and pain. And the doctors? What did they say about Elizabeth's condition? Mrs. Wilson lowered her voice even more. "That's the mystery. Physically, she should be able to walk. There's nothing in the tests that justifies the complete paralysis of her legs. The doctors say it might be emotional." Michael was silent for a few moments, processing the information. "She doesn't want to walk," he murmured more to himself. "What do you mean?" "If she walks, it means she has overcome the accident, and maybe she feels that overcoming would be betraying the family's pain, would be pretending that nothing happened." Mrs. Wilson looked at him with admiration. "You should have been a doctor, not a construction worker. Sometimes life teaches more than any college, Mrs. Wilson." That afternoon, Michael made a decision. When he was putting away his tools, he took a small piece of wood and began to carve. Using only a pocket knife he always carried, he shaped a small bird, very similar to the blue jays that Elizabeth liked to watch. The next day, during lunchtime, he discreetly approached the porch where Elizabeth was reading. "Elizabeth," he called softly. She looked around nervously before answering. "Hi, Mr. Johnson. Daddy said you can't talk to me." "I know, but I wanted to give you something real quick." He held out the small carved bird. Elizabeth's eyes lit up when she saw it. "It's beautiful. You made it." "I made it thinking of you. For when you miss the birds, you can't see up close." Elizabeth took the small bird carefully, as if it were made of crystal. "Thank you," she whispered. It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received. Keep it well hidden, okay? And whenever you look at it, remember that there are people who care about you." Elizabeth pressed the bird to her chest and smiled. It was a different smile, full of hope. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. A week later, Michael's work was almost finished. Only a few final adjustments on the roof remained and he could leave. Part of him felt relieved to leave that heavy atmosphere of sadness, but another part didn't want to abandon Elizabeth. It was on a Saturday morning that everything changed. Michael had arrived early to finish the last details when he heard raised voices coming from the main house. Not wanting to be nosy, he kept working, but the voices were too loud to ignore. "It's been 5 years, Catherine. 5 years you've locked yourself in that room as if you were dead too." It was Richard's voice, full of frustration and pain. "Do you think this is easy for me?" replied a weak female voice, which Michael assumed was Catherine, Elizabeth's mother. "Do you think I wouldn't want to start living normally again? Then why don't you try? Why don't you fight for our daughter like I'm fighting?" "Fighting?" Catherine's voice grew stronger. "You call it fighting to bring doctor after doctor, spending fortunes on treatments, but never stopping to really talk to her. And what should I say? That it's because of us that she's like this? No, you should tell her you love her no matter what, that she's more important than your guilt." Michael stopped working. For the first time, he was hearing the truth behind that family. Everyone was trapped in guilt, including Elizabeth. The argument continued for a few more minutes until he heard heavy footsteps and a door slamming hard. Richard had left the house visibly upset. Later that day, Michael saw something that moved him deeply. Elizabeth was on the porch as always, but this time she wasn't alone. A thin, fragile-looking woman was sitting in a chair beside her. It was Catherine, the mother he had never seen before. Mother and daughter were silent, just watching the garden. There was something infinitely sad about that scene, as if they were two lost people trying to find each other. During lunch, Mrs. Wilson approached him again. "Mrs. Catherine left her room today for the first time in months," she commented. "I think this morning's argument made her rethink some things." "What was she like before the accident?" "Completely different. She was cheerful, playful, always coming up with activities to do with Elizabeth. They were best friends. And now she can barely look at her daughter without crying. She blames herself for everything." Michael grew thoughtful. It was clear that Elizabeth's recovery didn't just depend on medical treatments, but on healing the whole family. In the late afternoon, while coming down from the roof for the last time, he saw Richard walking alone through the garden. The man seemed lost in thought, and Michael decided to approach him. "Mr. Anderson, may I speak with you?" Richard turned, surprised. "What is it?" "I know it's none of my business, but I've observed your family these past days. Elizabeth is a special girl." "Of course she's special. She's my daughter." "That's not what I mean. She's intelligent, sensitive, observant. But she's also carrying a weight she shouldn't carry alone." Richard looked at him suspiciously. "Where are you going with this?" "She doesn't walk because she won't allow herself to walk, and she won't allow herself to walk because she thinks it would be a betrayal of the family." "You don't understand anything about our situation." "I understand more than you might think. I also lost someone important. I also blamed myself. And I almost lost my daughter in the process." Richard stopped walking and looked directly at Michael. "What do you mean?" "When my wife passed away, I locked myself in my grief. I stopped playing with my daughter. I stopped talking to her. I stopped living. One day she asked me if I didn't love her anymore. That's when I realized that by trying to preserve her mother's memory, I was destroying her present." Richard was silent for a long moment. "And what did you do?" "I learned that honoring those we've lost doesn't mean stopping to live. It means living better, being better, loving more. It's not that simple. No, it's not. But looking at Elizabeth every day and seeing only the accident instead of the amazing girl she is, that isn't helping anyone." Richard sighed deeply. "The doctors say there's nothing physically wrong with her." "Because the problem isn't physical, it's emotional. She needs permission to be happy again. Permission from her family. And how do I give that permission? By starting to be happy yourself. By showing that life is still worth living even after what happened. That night, Michael went home thinking about the conversation he had with Richard. He had planted a seed, but he didn't know if it would sprout. On Sunday, since there was no work, Michael decided to do something he had been planning for days. He took his daughter Emily and brought her to the ranch. "Daddy, why did we come here?" asked Emily, a smart 10-year-old girl with brown hair and curious eyes. "I want you to meet a friend of mine, a girl your age who needs someone to talk to." When they arrived at the ranch, Michael asked Mrs. Wilson for permission for Emily to meet Elizabeth. The housekeeper thought the idea was wonderful and took them to the porch. The meeting between the two girls was magical. Emily, naturally outgoing, showed no awkwardness about Elizabeth's wheelchair. Within minutes, they were talking like old friends. "Do you like to draw?" asked Emily. "I love it, but I only have a black pencil." "I brought my colored pencils. Want to draw together?" Elizabeth nodded energetically, and soon the two were sitting on the porch, drawing and talking about everything. Michael watched from a distance, seeing Elizabeth laugh in a way he hadn't seen before. It was then that Richard appeared, drawn by his daughter's laughter. He stopped abruptly at the sight. "Who is that girl?" he asked Michael, but his voice held no anger, only curiosity. "That's my daughter, Emily. I thought it would be good for Elizabeth to have company her own age." Richard watched the girls for a few minutes. Elizabeth was showing her drawings to Emily, who was praising each one sincerely. "I haven't seen her like this in so long," murmured Richard, more to himself. "Children have an incredible ability to find joy in the little things," commented Michael. "They just need permission to do it." At that moment, Catherine appeared on the porch. It was the first time Michael had seen her up close. She was a beautiful woman, but there was a fragility in her eyes that told the whole story of the suffering of the last few years. "Mom!" shouted Elizabeth excitedly. "Come meet my new friend." Catherine approached hesitantly. Emily, without any shyness, introduced herself, and soon was telling Elizabeth's mother about their drawings. "Elizabeth draws very well, Mrs. Catherine," said Emily naturally. "She drew a bird just like the ones that stay here in the garden." Catherine looked at her daughter's drawing, and her eyes filled with tears. "It's beautiful, my dear," she whispered. "You've always been so talented." It was the first genuine moment of connection between mother and daughter in a very long time. The hours passed quickly, and when it was time to leave, Emily said goodbye to Elizabeth with a tight hug. "Can I come back next week?" she asked. "Yes, you can," replied Richard, surprising everyone, including himself. On the way back home, Emily talked excitedly about her new friend. "Daddy, why can't Elizabeth walk?" "She was in an accident, sweetie. But she moves her feet when she gets excited. I saw it." Michael stopped the car abruptly. "What do you mean, Emily?" "When she laughed at my jokes, her toes moved inside her sneakers. I don't think she noticed." Michael felt a wave of hope. If Elizabeth was moving her feet unconsciously, it meant the paralysis really wasn't physical. On Monday, he arrived at the ranch with a different energy. She went to Mrs. Wilson and told her about Emily's observation. "That's wonderful," she exclaimed. "It means there's hope. It means she needs more moments of genuine joy, moments when she forgets that she can't walk." In the following days, Emily began visiting Elizabeth regularly. Richard, who initially resisted, ended up allowing and even encouraging the visits when he saw how they transformed his daughter's mood. Catherine also started participating more. She rediscovered the pleasure of talking with Elizabeth, listening to her stories, and sharing good memories from the past. It was on a Thursday that the first significant breakthrough happened. The girls were playing in the garden when Emily dropped a doll under a low bench. "I can't reach it," said Emily. "Elizabeth, can you?" Without thinking, Elizabeth leaned over in her chair and stretched her arm. When that wasn't enough, she automatically tried to stand up to reach the doll. For a few seconds, she stood, leaning on the bench, before realizing what she was doing and letting herself fall back into the chair. "You stood up!" shouted Emily excitedly. Elizabeth looked at her own legs with astonishment and fear. "I shouldn't have done that," she murmured, tears beginning to flow. "Why not?" asked Emily, genuinely confused. Because if I walk, it means everything is okay, and everything is not okay." Emily frowned, trying to understand. "But you staying in the chair won't make things okay again. It will only make you sad forever." The simplicity of Emily's observation hit Elizabeth hard. The girl began to cry, but this time they weren't tears of fear, they were tears of release. Mrs. Wilson, who had witnessed everything, ran to call Richard and Catherine. When they arrived, they found Elizabeth being comforted by Emily, who hugged her with all the sincerity that only a child can offer. "She stood up," said Mrs. Wilson emotionally, "for a few seconds, but she did." Richard knelt beside his daughter. "Elizabeth, my dear, look at me." She raised her eyes, red from crying. "Daddy, I managed to stand up, but I felt like I was doing something wrong." "Why, my dear?" "Because you were so sad after the accident. If I get better, you'll think I don't care about what happened." Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. His daughter had spent 5 years punishing herself to not hurt her parents' feelings. "My dear," he said with a choked voice, "nothing in the world would make us happier than to see you walk again, nothing." Catherine approached and knelt on the other side of Elizabeth. "My love, the accident was my fault, not yours. You don't need to carry this pain. You need to live, be happy, grow up. That's what we want most." "Really?" asked Elizabeth in a small voice. "Really?" the parents answered in unison. At that moment, Michael Johnson watched everything from afar, feeling he had fulfilled his mission there. That family was finally beginning to heal. In the following weeks, Elizabeth gradually began working to regain movement in her legs. It wasn't easy. 5 years without walking had weakened her muscles, and fear still dominated her in many moments. But now she had the full support of her family. Richard hired a specialized physical therapist who visited the ranch 3 times a week. Catherine began actively participating in the sessions, encouraging her daughter with every small progress. Emily continued to be a constant presence, turning every exercise into play and every small achievement into a reason for celebration. Michael Johnson had finished his work at the ranch, but Richard invited him to continue visiting the family. He had become more than an employee. He was a friend who had changed their lives. "How can I thank you for what you've done for us?" asked Richard one afternoon. "Seeing your family happy again," replied Michael. "That's the best payment I could receive." 3 months after the first day she stood up, Elizabeth took her first steps. They were just 3 wobbly steps, supported between her father and mother, but they were the most important steps of her life. Emily was there, of course, cheering and shouting with joy, as if it were her own achievement. "You did it! You did it!" she shouted, jumping with emotion. Elizabeth smiled through tears of happiness. For the first time in 5 years, she felt whole again. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The months that followed brought a complete transformation at Clearwater Ranch. Elizabeth progressed day after day, not just physically but emotionally. Her natural joy had returned, and she became the curious and smart girl she'd always been. Catherine also blossomed. The guilt that had consumed her for years began to fade as she saw her daughter recovering. She returned to actively participating in family life and rediscovered small pleasures she had forgotten. Richard, in turn, learned to balance his paternal concern with Elizabeth's need to be independent. He stopped treating her as if she were made of glass and began encouraging her to explore her own capabilities. One day, Michael received an unexpected phone call from Richard. "Michael, I need to speak with you. Can you come here today, Kaish?" "Of course. Did something happen?" "Something good. Very good." When Michael arrived at the ranch with Emily, he was greeted by a scene that moved him deeply. Elizabeth was in the garden, not in the wheelchair, but walking slowly with the help of crutches. She had progressed much more than he had imagined. "Mr. Johnson!" she shouted when she saw him, and began walking toward him with her crutches. Michael ran to meet her halfway and hugged her tenderly. "I'm so proud of you," he said with a choked voice. "It all started with you," she replied. "If it weren't for you, I never would have had the courage." Emily also ran to hug her friend, and the two girls embraced, laughing and crying at the same time. Richard approached with Catherine. "Michael, you changed our family. We don't know how to thank you." "What you did for us goes beyond any payment," added Catherine. "You gave us back our daughter and brought our family back to life," Richard finished. Michael looked at that family gathered together, smiling and hugging, and felt a deep satisfaction. Sometimes the greatest transformations happen through the simplest gestures. "Actually," said Richard, "we have a proposal for you." "What kind of proposal?" "We want you to be our general manager, to oversee all the ranch's renovations and construction, with a much better salary than you make as an independent mason." Michael was surprised. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," shouted Elizabeth. "That way Emily can come here every day." Michael looked at his daughter, who nodded energetically in agreement with the idea. "Well," he said, smiling, "how can I refuse an invitation like that?" And so, Michael Johnson, the humble mason who accepted a simple renovation job, became part of the Anderson family, not just as an employee, but as the man who had taught them all about forgiveness, healing, and the transformative power of unconditional love. Elizabeth continued her recovery and little by little abandoned the crutches. She returned to running, playing, and exploring the world with the natural curiosity of a child. But more important than that, she learned that she didn't need to carry the guilt for the mistakes of adults. Emily and Elizabeth grew up like sisters, constantly visiting each other and sharing adventures and secrets. Their friendship was proof that sometimes it's through the eyes of a child that we can see the simplest solutions to the most complex problems. Richard and Catherine rediscovered their love for each other and for life. The accident would always be a mark in their stories, but no longer a prison. They learned that honoring the past doesn't mean being stuck in it. And Michael, the simple man who just wanted to do his work honestly, discovered that his true calling wasn't building houses, but rebuilding lives. On the first anniversary of Elizabeth's recovery, the family organized a party in the ranch garden. All the employees were invited, and joy took over the place that was once dominated by sadness. Elizabeth, now running freely through the garden with Emily, stopped in front of Michael. "Mr. Johnson, can I ask you a question?" "Of course, my dear." "Why did you care about me?" "Why?" "You didn't even know me." Michael knelt down to be at her level and smiled. "Because sometimes, Elizabeth, we find people who need help at the exact moment we need to help someone, and when that happens, magic happens." Magic? Magic. The magic of love that heals, that transforms, that makes miracles happen. Elizabeth hugged him tightly. "Thank you for teaching me about that magic. Thank you for letting me be part of it." As the party continued around them, Michael looked at the sky and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Gratitude for finding that family at the right time, for having the courage to get involved, and for being an instrument of a transformation that had changed not only their lives, but also his own. Clearwater Ranch was no longer a place of sadness. It was a place of hope, love, and second chances. And all of this had started with a simple man who refused to ignore a child's suffering. Years passed, and the story of Michael and Elizabeth became legend in the region. People told of the construction worker who had restored a little girl's ability to walk. But those who really knew the story understood that the true miracle had been much greater. Michael hadn't just helped Elizabeth walk again. He had taught an entire family to live again, to love again, to believe again that even after the greatest tragedies, it's still possible to find happiness. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all, that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to extend a hand for miracles to happen. That simple, true love has the power to heal wounds that seemed impossible to mend. Elizabeth grew up and became a strong, determined young woman, graduating in physical therapy to help other children going through what she had experienced. Emily became her partner in this project, and together they created a rehabilitation institute that served children from underprivileged families. Richard and Catherine became dedicated grandparents and remained married, more united than ever. The tragedy that almost destroyed them ended up strengthening their bonds in ways they never imagined possible. And Michael. Michael continued being what he always was, a simple, hard-working man with a big heart. The difference was that now he knew his ability to touch lives went far beyond his skill at building houses. The last time we saw the whole family together was at Emily and Elizabeth's wedding. Not to each other, of course, but they both got married on the same day, in a double ceremony that celebrated not only romantic love, but the eternal friendship that had been born in that garden years before. Michael walked both brides down the aisle, as proud as the father he had become to both of them, and when the pastor asked if anyone opposed the unions, he shouted from the bottom of his heart, "I oppose anyone who doesn't believe in love's power to transform lives." Everyone laughed, and tears of joy streamed down the faces of the entire congregation. Because this is a story about more than medicine or miracles. It's a story about how true love, offered without expecting anything in return, has the power to heal wounds that go far beyond the physical body. It's a story about second chances, about forgiveness, about the courage to start over, even when all seems lost. But above all, it's a story about how a simple man with simple tools and a big heart managed to rebuild an entire family. End of story. And you, dear listener, what did you think of this story of perseverance and love? Which moment moved you the most? Leave your comment sharing your honest opinion and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other inspiring stories like this one. Thank you so much for your company.